In this presentation, I'm going to do a brief overview of the history of the Internet and the World Wide Web, which is much longer and more robust than most people realize. And I'm not going to go into all of the details, but I'm going to hit some of the highlights that I think are going to be particularly important. The first of which is that the early seeds of the Internet were actually planted in 1958. This was when what was referred to as DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, was established so that the United States could develop basically a large think tank when it came to technologies to compete and keep up with the former Soviet Union. So this is what really launched and was the catalyst for the whole thing. Then a few years later, in 1961, Leonard Kleinrock, who worked at MIT, published a paper on packet switching. We're going to get into packet switching in one of the later presentations, but basically what it does is it was a way of breaking down information into smaller packets of data, tearing them all apart, and then reassembling them as they were to make it easier to send information across wires. And so that's the basis of how the internet works. Now in 1969, DARPA became ARPA, the defense part went away. It just became the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and they established what was known as ARPANET. ARPANET consisted of 4 universities, which was the University of Utah, University of California, Santa Barbara, Stanford University, and the University of California, Los Angeles. And what they did is this was the first time that the internet, as we know it, was kind of used. They actually were able to send data across lines and transmit that data from one university to the next, and they were all able to access it. So this is really now going from DARPA to the ARPANET, which was the beginnings. This is where the internet started, and the internet is really all about connecting machines. It's the underlying piece. It's the underlying infrastructure. It's what is connecting my computer to a computer server that connects to your computer, and so on and so forth. And that is what happened with ARPANET in those first 4 universities. Then in 1972, email was invented, something that we use every single day. And the part that's really kind of funny is the very, very first message that was sent was really just typing in a bunch of the keys. And it was QWERTYUIOP. If you look at your keyboard, you'll see that it's just the first line of letters across the top. Jumping from the internet to the personal computing world, because these run parallel to each other, is in 1977, the Apple II was introduced to the public. This was the first personal computer that was not in kit form. Prior to that, the only way to buy computers that were used at home was to buy a kit that basically had all of the parts, the components, and it had the circuit maps and diagrams that people would put together. This was really for hobbyists and enthusiasts of the idea of computing. So the Apple II, having it where it had a monitor, it had the keyboard, it had the hard drive, was really revolutionary. And we're going to see how personal computing and the internet are important when they start to come together, because up until now they've actually been working down parallel lines and have not yet intersected. In 1979, we saw the next development of ARPANET, which, again, if you remember, is that underlying framework of the internet. Usenet, which was founded in 1979, consisted of news groups and the ability for people to share and exchange information. This was still all text-based. There was no pictures. This was still predominantly government-based, but this is now developing beyond the foundation of the internet into some of the earlier entries into what will eventually become known as the World Wide Web. In 1981, this is when things really started to change because some very pivotal things were starting to happen. At this point, the government relinquished their control over the ARPANET, and so you no longer had to be connected to the government networks to connect the computers from one to the other. Some of the first to embrace this outside of the government were colleges and universities across the United States. So this is now without the government piece, and it's allowed to expand. You can see where this is going to go. Related to the growth of this is in 1984, Apple introduced the Macintosh computer, which we are all familiar with in this day and age. So it became one of the first really truly affordable personal computers. And then in 1985, so only a year later, Microsoft introduced Windows to be used on personal computers. So we know now that personal computing is becoming more affordable and therefore more likely to be in people's homes. And the ARPANET has now been released into the public domain so that average citizens can connect and communicate on it. Then the really big thing for what we now know as the World Wide Web was in 1991, a guy by the name of Tim Berners-Lee, who worked at CERN in Switzerland, which is, if you've heard of it, the Large Hadron Collider. It's where they're trying to split atoms and do some other pretty fantastic scientific research. Well, in 1991, Tim Berners-Lee wanted a way to make it easier for people to exchange information via this net, via the Usenet or the ARPANET that was out there. And he is the one who officially invented what we now know as the World Wide Web, or the www that shows up in front of many of the web addresses that we see. He is also the one who invented the coding language that we are going to be using, which is HTML. He did this so that people now could have a more visual interface. It was still predominantly text, but he wanted this as a way for scientists to exchange research in an easier fashion and a more visual fashion. Well, then very shortly after that, in 1993, the first web browser was invented, the web browser as we know it, which is called Mosaic. As you can see in this graphic, it was really basic. It was text links, text, and images. There was no formatting, CSS, styles, none of that existed at that particular point in time. But it was a vast improvement, and this is when the World Wide Web as we know it took off. And it went crazy from there because it was in 1988, 1999, and into 2000 that the world of e-commerce started to really grow, and people discovered that they needed to have a presence of some sort on the World Wide Web. Now, to differentiate, and this will be the last thing that's covered in this video, you can look further on the graphic that I've provided if you want to see some more of the history. But to differentiate, the internet is the infrastructure. It is the machines that talk to each other. It is the servers talking to each other and talking to your computers. The World Wide Web sits on top of that, and that is user-based. That's the people connecting, the people creating the information and sharing the information. So that's the big differentiator. So you can see that the internet and the World Wide Web have a much longer history, well, the internet anyway, that it started, or at least glimmers of it started as early as the late 1950s, and then the World Wide Web showed up in 1991. So with that, I thank you. That's a brief history of the internet and the World Wide Web. In the next video, we're actually going to talk about how the internet and the World Wide Web work together and some terminology to get you familiar with things.